And on behalf of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Justice, I welcome you all to our lecture, the webinar on Bangabandhu Nationalism and Internationalism, Public Reasoning and Lessons for Our Times. My name is Naureen Rahim, and today I shall be moderating the session. Tonight, we are delighted to have Dr. Haider Ali Khan as the guest speaker in this event, who has joined us from the US. Dr. Khan is a distinguished professor of economics at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies, University of Denver. He has been involved as an advisor to several education institutions and serving as an international advisor to the European Economic and Social Committee. I would request the audience to mute their microphones and during the lecture, you can post your questions to the speaker in the chat box here if you're attending this event through Zoom platform. I also request if you have any comments to convey to the speaker, you can also write it down in the chat box. I shall try to post most of the questions and comments to the speaker. This lecture is a special lecture from the center, which is a tribute to the heroic contribution of our father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and to observe Mujib Borsho. To begin with, I may now request Mr. Mufidul Haq, Director, Center for the Study of Genocide and Justice, and Trustee, Liberation War Museum, to give his welcome address to the audience.
A warm welcome to everybody and a good day to everyone, because it's morning in some part of the world and we are late evening in Bangladesh, and we are very happy to launch this lecture series. This is part of our effort to commemorate the birth centenary of Father of the Nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, and we do not need to add any more things with his name, but we need to study his life, his contribution, and his role in history. I think that's the great task that we have been entrusted with. And on behalf of the Liberation War Museum, we are engaged in this task. We are committed to meet the challenge. And every year we organize a lecture on August. This year, it's a very special year, the birth centenary of Father of the Nation. And we thought that we will start a series of lectures focusing on different aspects of his life. And we are happy that we are initiating this with the special lecture by Professor Haider Ali Khan. It's very difficult to introduce him to the audience. I can only say that you will understand his depth of knowledge, his analytical mind, and the way he can contextualize the contribution of Bangabandhu and the significance of emergence of Bangladesh in broad historical perspective, and also looking at it from the contemporary social, economic, and political theory, and adding a new dimension. And I think that's the most important aspect of such analysis. And he is also a man with a varied interest. He is a poet, he is a singer, he is very much a public intellectual, and most importantly, his academic pursuits also reflect this. And you will also see that sometimes he becomes a bit philosophical, sometimes, or maybe always, the touch of poetry in his essays, and most importantly, the deep insight. And I think this lecture is very important because we do not have much time in such lecture. And also, this is the first time we are organizing lectures in webinar in Zoom link. And we are doing this since the COVID-19 attack, which has crippled us in many ways. And we say that our museum, doors of our museum are closed, but we are opening our windows. And this is another window that we are opening. And this is a great opportunity for all of us to use the social media platform, the digital communication, and use it effectively and meaningfully. So I do not want to dwell much on this because his lecture will speak for himself. But he was very much involved with the liberation struggle, with the political culture movement of the late 60s. And as a young student, he went to USA in March on an exchange program. I think in January, maybe in late January, and he was supposed to come back on March, but he got struck because of the genocidal attack and also the fall of Bangabandhu. With that, people jumped into our liberation struggle, and he was also part of this struggle. But that's a long story. He has written a memoir on this, and he has written other books, and we are very happy that he will deliver this lecture on the theme of Bangabandhu nationalism and internationalism, looking at the whole issue of Bangabandhu's contribution from a broad perspective, but also not only linking it with the present, but focusing it on the future and the task that we are interested with and what a young generation need to be do in the coming days. So with this, words, I would like to stop here and give the floor to Haider Khan and also to Naureen Rahim to initiate the lecture. Thank you all. And we hope that the Q&A session will be very exciting for all of us. And you can, as has been said, you can put your questions on the chat box and you will also have opportunity to interact. So thanks to everybody, and the floor is to you, Noreen.
Thank you, sir. This lecture shall provide the audience a brief idea of the oppressed people worldwide who have struggled for liberation and independence, with a specific focus on Bangladesh. The speaker shall narrate his involvement in such struggle in 1971 and how he explored the charismatic leadership of the father of the nation, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. I believe in the end of the lecture, he shall speak also about some of the strategies, some strategic agendas to the youth at present who are engaged in various movements against oppression, racism, etc. Now, without any further ado, I may request our speaker to this webinar to deliver his lecture. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Noreen, and my heartfelt thanks to all of you, especially to Mr. Mufidul Haq, a freedom fighter, and very dear to me. I always call him Mufid Bhai, affectionately, and my respect and my affection for him truly are boundless. I also thank the audience, especially the audience that has gotten up very early and those who have waited all day. This is very gratifying for me. I also see among the names that I can see on my screen, some old friends, some new friends or friends to be, and some of my students, my former students. I welcome you all, I thank you all, and I hope the little I have to say will be of some value and rewarding for your labor. I should start by saying that I have very deep emotions, as I know many in the audience, also from my generation especially, and the generation before mine, who participated actively, must have. The emotion that I feel most at the moment is one of humility. I feel deeply humble because even at that time, I did not realize, and I think many people like me who were participants or observers or both, did not realize what a momentous event or a series of events we were participants in and witness to. And also the leaders who led us, especially Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, we, of course, were full of respect and admiration, but at least I did not realize then the depth of their sacrifice, their commitment, and their wisdom. I don't want to present the leadership as infallible or perfect. No leadership is ever like that. So the leadership in our liberation struggle in Bangladesh in 1960, East Pakistan and Bangladesh in 1960 and 70, they were not perfect. And in the few books that I have written, and I am afraid that I have to write a few more to justice, at least partial justice to this vast subject, I have tried to explore these dimensions. So I have a feeling of deep humility. I have a feeling of respectfulness, of reverence even, and of great and deep sadness because of this time of the year. As we all know from history, that on 15th of August 1975, a brutal coup was carried out by junior army officers, but they were aided by and abetted by not just some people at the higher echelons of the military, but also some foreign powers. I don't want to go into that right now. If somebody wants to discuss it during the question and answer period, I'll be happy to discuss it to the extent that I can. But today, I want to remind the audience, especially the young people among the audience, of what Noreen just said, that I have an agenda of thought and action, especially for the younger generations in all the countries on our planet in the 21st century, because we are facing a grave situation. Perhaps our whole planetary civilization has never faced multiple threats of the kind that we face today. And we have to do what we can, and we have to do it together. And we have to learn from the successes and failures of past movements, of past leadership, and we have to carry the struggle forward in a better way in these very, very crisis-ridden, difficult times indeed. But in my talk today, I will do it in three parts. First of all, I will give you a brief overview of my project or projects. And I will also try to give you some feeling for what it was like to be alive that day, or that through that decade, I should say. And I will present the 11 points of those points for thought and action for the young people right at the end of this, because the next two sections will be historical, although historical with lessons for us today. In the second part, I will discuss the quite briefly the main trajectories of struggle since the founding of Pakistan until the beginning of Mukti Juddho. And then in the final part, I will discuss Bangabandhu's internationalism and international activities after his return in early 1972 in Bangladesh. But I will show, I hope in a way that may be new to at least some of you, that Bangabandhu's internationalism was not a sudden development. It was there throughout his life, from his earliest days of political involvement, and certainly from the founding of Awami League in 1949 onwards. So I will try to do this briefly because I cannot do justice to these vast panoramic events, these historical continuities and ruptures both in this brief lecture. For me, it has been a lifelong project, and for as long as I am able to write and think, I will continue this. So without further ado, let me launch into the first section, and please allow me to take you to a certain day in January 1971. More precisely, I'm talking about the 3rd of January, 1971. This was a momentous day for many of us, and many, I'm sure, still remember that day, especially among the founders of Mukti Juddho Jadughar, the Liberation War Museum, and other Mukti Joddhas, freedom fighters from that period, like Mufid Bhai. Those memories must be still very vivid as are mine. Actually, I was not very old at that time, certainly much younger than I am today. I was a teenager, still in high school, but involved because of family and friends, and because of the times in politics already, and as Mufid Bhai mentioned, especially in the cultural front. And on that day, some of the young activists of Awami League and of East Pakistan Student Union together had taken me to that venue and put me in a place because of their kindness. I think from where I could observe the events very well. I don't want to go into the details, but Wordsworth writes in his great autobiographical, really epic poem, The Prelude, about the French Revolution, that bliss it was to be alive that day, but to be young was very heaven. And I felt exactly like that. And in my book, I have actually described that scene more at length. But I want to mention it because it is probably not possible for younger people today to realize revolutions really are mass processes and mass events. Leaders emerge because of the situation and because of their long experience of struggle and sacrifices in struggles. So there is a logic to revolutionary leadership. It's not politics as usual. It's not just crass opportunism and following the wind, no matter in which direction it blows. Good revolutionary leadership, as Bangabandhu's was, and as many other people's at that time was, is really based on very sound, fundamental, deeply felt, firmly held principles. But they also are based on strategic vision. They are based on good tactical sense, and all of these things Bangabandhu really combined in more proportions, I think, to a higher degree than the other leaders of that time. And this is not to belittle the other leaders whom I respect a great deal. People like Maulana Bhashani of NAP, of Muzaffar Ahmad of NAP, of Mani Singh of Communist Party, and many other leaders. Even Nurul Amin, who was quite reactionary in many ways, at times criticized the government, but from his own rather conservative position. As a historian, I try to be fair to all the actors, but I also want to give the proper evaluation to everyone, including the architect in a way, and the leader of the liberation movement increasingly from 1969 onwards, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And let me just quickly mention here that I have tried to, and I should say I really had to invent some new concepts. Mufid Bhai talked about philosophical bent of my mind, as well as the poetic bent of my mind. They're actually not as unrelated as some people might think. They are quite related, especially in modern thinkers like Alain Badiou of France, who was my teacher actually at one point, and Bakhtin, who of course was dead by the time I started reading him. I have used their theoretical contributions as well as my own thinking about our movement. The basis of my thinking is really the actual movement and experience and analysis of that movement. I notice that quite often, this happens more often with students with degrees from Western universities, and Western universities are good. I don't want to belittle them. I teach in one. I've learned a lot from thinkers in the West and continue to learn. But each movement has its own historic and geographical specificities, although they have their global connections. I will show that quite soon. The problem with, I think, most people who go to graduate school and get PhD is that they basically regurgitate ideas that they learn from textbooks, mostly written here in the West, and from professors that they learn from here in the West. Again, I don't want to say that all the professors here are provincial in the sense that Dipesh Chakravorty calls Europe provincial. There is clearly some provincialism there. But they try to be universal, or they think they're universal, and some of them actually are humble enough and self-critical enough to study other parts of the world from the points of view of the people of that world, especially the downtrodden and oppressed people of that part of the world. But I think they are rather exceptional. And therefore, we have a scholarship that is largely derivative. And it is truly a pity. People like Alatas, Abdul Malik, and then more recently Edward Said, they have all talked about decolonizing the mind. I teach Ngugi wa Thiong'o's books and lectures. Some of you know that Ngugi wa Thiong'o actually changed his name because he didn't want to be known as James Ngugi. James was a name missionaries gave him through his family. And his writings, of course, are very well worth reading. But I tried to develop my theoretical concepts like polychronotope and even eventualizing dynamics, etc., that when you read my books will run into by keeping the experience of our movement in mind. And I don't want to make my lecture today jargon-ridden. Those who are interested, we can discuss during Q&A, and also I have written on these things in many different modes, from mathematical to the poetical. And I will try to finish my talk, by the way, with a bit of poetry about Bangabandhu in particular, but about our struggle and struggle of the present and the future. Okay, I think it will be clear from the way I talk in what way I identify theory as deriving from practice, from a clarification and distillation of real practice in the real world, in real places, and in real time, real historical time. Okay, enough of that. Bangabandhu actually, as we know, sadly, no more. And I will just say that Bangabandhu in death needs neither adulation nor condemnation, but rather the world needs an objective evaluation of the most important ideas that motivated millions of people during their struggle for self-determination. In many ways, Bangabandhu embodied symbolically their aspirations, and his ideas concentrated the inchoate but deeply felt needs of the people. The specific, in some particular instances in space and time, even unique historical trajectories of secular, democratic, and social ideals and discourses of politics and political economy are the most important in my studies, at least. Undoubtedly, there is much to be criticized, if for no other reason than simply for incompleteness. So my aim is to extend the discussion in several useful directions for the future. And again, I refer people to what I have published because I cannot cover all of them here. But perhaps I think it is good to go through those 11 points for the young people. In the title of my own summary, I have added public reasoning, because that is very important for a person who was lifelong, really, even towards the end of his life, which is somewhat controversial in some circles. He was committed to deeply democratic ideals, not just parliamentary democracy in its formal manifestation, but really democracy of the people, for the people, by the people. Public reasoning is very important for such a person, and I have shown in several of my books how deeply committed Bangabandhu was to public reasoning. I have had many conversations with many of the freedom fighters, and they all agree on these points, especially Professor Rehman Sobhan, a very respected figure and also a very productive figure, one of my role models. Professor Nurul Islam, a great economist, also a freedom fighter, a close advisor to Bangabandhu. They both agree on this point, and I think they are right. Young people, I think, have to learn from that kind of commitment to public reasoning by Bangabandhu and all people with deeply democratic values. So what would reasoning and a deep understanding of Bangabandhu's struggle tell us, and especially the young people of today? These are the points, and I will go over them quickly. So methodologically and substantively, for progressive political practice, the most important lesson for young people everywhere from the lifelong political activism of Bangabandhu is to recognize the importance of building progressive political movements and to learn constantly from within the movement about the relationships between the local and global politics, between the complex, sometimes with many contradictory elements that need to be confronted and analyzed openly and honestly. So this complex nationalism of the oppressed and the equally complex democratic internationalism from below. So this is an abiding theme, and this theme will be very important both for the global north, as we call this now, and the global south. Secondly, the post-World War II socioeconomic, political, social democratic, or embedded liberal consensus in the global north is frayed, to put it mildly. Young people need to build various types of socially oriented democratic movements today. Thirdly, in the global south, although export-led growth became possible for some countries that pursued what I have called strategic openness, most countries did not or could not achieve this kind of growth. There are important consequences of this. Fourth, furthermore, the gains from globalization, when present, have been unevenly distributed everywhere. Consequently, inequalities in income and wealth distribution have risen almost everywhere in the world in the late 20th and in the 21st century so far. Fifth, therefore, we have a heavily polarized world, both in the global north and in the global south. We have to build a movement for fighting to remove the root causes of polarization, the root causes of polarization. We cannot just fight it superficially and fight a few symptoms and take a few kind of palliative measures, which is what most often is done by the liberals. They are not bad. I don't oppose them. I support them actually very strongly, and I support them more deeply than they do, in fact. But we have to go to the root causes. Number 6, building various types of socially oriented democratic movements will require courage and steadfastness. But these qualities are not enough. From Bangabandhu and the Bangladesh Liberation Movement, we can also learn the value of organizing in a detailed, consistent manner relentlessly, always going lower and deeper among the masses. Learning from Rosa Luxemburg's dialectical analysis, which was independently rediscovered and applied creatively by Bangabandhu, we should fight for both broad and specific reforms everywhere, but build a base for ever deeper social and democratic transformations within our fight for reforms. This is a very, very important point, perhaps the most important point in my 11 points. It was one of my discoveries, surprising discoveries actually, because I was stuck in a different mode of thought, that Bangabandhu discovered this independently. He probably never read Rosa Luxemburg. I'm sure he had heard of her, but he discovered this through his own experience, through his own involvement in mass movements and rising to the leadership with a certain degree of international awareness in these movements. Okay, let me go on to the 7th point. One must build local and global anti-racist and anti-fascist democratic coalitions strategically. But tactics need to be flexible and adaptable according to changing internal, that is national, and external, that is international conditions. Bangabandhu really was extremely masterful in this, as I will show in the 2nd and 3rd parts of my talk. Point number 8, there will be no narrow, one-size-fits-all narrative of struggle. Instead, there will be many voices. This is the polyphony that I arrive at theoretically. There will be many voices necessitating the building of appropriate polyphonic narratives of resistance. It is crucial for all voices to be heard and all liberatory points of view to be discussed openly. Point number 9, as the eventualizing dynamics unfold with multiple trajectories in specific parts of the world, the leaders of mass movements must choose carefully and optimally at each step, but know that all liberation struggles must embrace to various degrees some uncertainty. It is not possible to build a progressive political movement without embracing uncertainty, but to do it in a rational manner. You have to be prepared to make mistakes, but you should try to avoid making too big mistakes. And that's one of the gains from reading history carefully and creatively. This is something that we can learn from all struggles, including the struggles in Bangladesh and the leadership of Bangabandhu and other leaders. Number 10, therefore, a polychronotope of struggle will be the norm. But how to understand the polychronotope for each situation and sequence of events is an empirical matter, calling also for a great deal of political judgment and maturity so that both ultra-leftist adventurism and opportunistic rightism can be avoided at crucial strategic junctures. This will truly have to be an exercise in the applied science of complex socio-economic political systems. Bangabandhu's life of steadfast political engagement has many specific lessons to offer that we can discuss. Finally, number 11, the progressive struggles themselves will be kaleidoscopic, but broad qualities like anti-patriarchy, anti-racism, including respecting the rights of minority groups, particularly the indigenous peoples and movements, towards equalizing socially embedded capabilities. This is another concept that is an extension of my respected teacher, Nobel laureate Professor Amartya Sen's idea of capabilities. So equalizing socially embedded capabilities for all will give an egalitarian strategic focus for deepening democracy. This is very important. Together with a steady strategy of democratic internationalism, the movements of the future will be able to organize for liberation, both locally and globally in an integrated manner. Okay, that completes the first part, and let's go on to Bangabandhu's life and activities in a little more detail within the context of the movement in then East Pakistan. We know that the division of India in 1947 was a very complicated affair and did not really lead to real freedom for the great majority of the people. In my book, I have given a translation of the great poem by the great poet Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Subhe Azadi, The Dawn of Freedom, where he points out how false this dawn of freedom really was. I don't have time to read my translation to you during this talk, but I'll be happy to share it with whoever wants to read it. And those who know Urdu probably have already read it in Urdu or can read it in Urdu. There are probably translations in Bangla too. At that time, as many of you know, Bangabandhu, who was not Bangabandhu, of course, at that time, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, is student and a student activist and leader already in the progressive wing of Muslim League that was led by Hussein Shahid Sorwardi and also by Abul Hashim. It was because of the activists of that wing that Muslim League won in Bengal. And without that, probably Pakistan would never have been established. But for these people and the people who came from the lower classes and middle classes in Bengal among the Muslims, the dream of Pakistan was really the dream of ending of all kinds of oppression, of domination by other classes, by other groups, a liberation for them, their language, their culture, their economy, their politics. None of this actually was going to happen. It became very clear almost immediately. This was brought into sharp focus by the language issue, as many of you know, but that was not the only issue. We have detailed histories, including some of my own discussion about how from really almost August or even a little before that, people were seriously wondering about the purpose of Pakistan and what the actual evolution of the history of Pakistan was going to be. And this became very acute, as I said, with respect to language, but it was also acute in terms of struggles of the people from below. And Bangabandhu participated in both. He participated not in just asserting the cultural autonomy of people in East Pakistan, but also he participated actively in the demands that fourth class workers in Dhaka University were making for higher pay and better working conditions. So people who think that Sheikh Mujib was just a leader of middle class dreamers and opportunists, a claim that I hear often from even very educated people in Bangladesh, I think really don't know history at all, because right from the very beginning of his political career, Bangabandhu was most concerned about the problems and possible solutions for those problems of especially the most oppressed, the most downtrodden sections of the people. And this remained a constant throughout his life. So I want to draw attention to that because most people don't seem to remember that or realize that, or many of them never knew that. And during the Bhasha Andolan, the language movement, because of his participation in this and other movements, he was in jail. So the history of Sheikh Mujib can be told even in terms of history of his being in jail, because in his short life of 55 years, he spent almost 20 years of that in jail. Starting from almost the founding of Pakistan. This is something I learned by trying to do serious research on his life. You can learn a lot by seriously reading the police reports and the reports of the intelligence branch, the secret police. And I learned a lot. I don't have time to quote you from those sources, but those sources are very valuable to a historian in learning about the life of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and of course of other people who were in jail. And one thing that happened in jails at that time, and Kamal Lohani, who as you know, passed away recently, was very close to many of us. And we are also related in family terms, told me once that much of his education was in the jail. In jail, actually, they had seminars. They couldn't have webinars, but they had real seminars and real discussions about both practice and theory. And Bangabandhu was also a participant in those things, and his deep, lifelong respect for intellectuals, something that also many people who are facile critics of Bangabandhu don't seem to realize or acknowledge, really come from all those roots. So these jails were actually universities for these people, and maybe better universities than the ones that we teach in now, politically speaking. So we find here a fighter, and from early on, fighter for autonomy, but also fighter for economic and social justice. I can give you many, many instances, but I want to also mention his internationalism that I promised that I would bring out. In the council meeting of Awami League, Awami League was founded, as you know, on the 23rd of June, 1949. And about 3-4 years later, they would have the first council meeting in which the two key proposals actually were moved by Maulana Abdul Hamid Khan Bhashani, who was the leader of Awami League at that time, and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. And Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, in pointing out, his point was about organizational solidity and how to build deep roots strategically. But amazingly, and I said amazingly for myself, really, because I didn't know this before doing research. I found that he was referring to the French Revolution, that we may actually become like the conventionalists in French Revolution, unless we are careful and have deep connections with the masses. Those of you who have read the history of French Revolution will know that these were a group, initially it started out as a center-left coalition, but they became more centrist and eventually moved towards the right. So Sheikh Mujib actually was interested in history of revolutions right from his youth. Maybe he did not have the opportunity to study this systematically, but he certainly picked up crucial parts, crucial points from these studies. And then I also want to mention the fact that he not only was an activist, an organizer for Awami League from among the leaders. This was exceptional because not many leaders actually had the kind of connections with ordinary people, even in the opposition parties, as Sheikh Mujib did. There is a saying, I don't know exactly who said it, but I've heard it several times, that the only people who really knew how to function in jail and out of jail during the repressive part of both Indian and Pakistani rule were the communists, and only non-communists who actually knew how to function in jail and out of jail was Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. So he was an unusual type of leader from among the bourgeois and petty bourgeois segments of the population. And therefore he was rightly respected by all kinds of people, but especially people who had connections with people from below and the people from below themselves. In the 1950s, he was fortunate to travel in many countries for 2 months, as you know. He also went to China, and he has written on China. And reading those, you will realize correctly that Sheikh Mujib was no narrow nationalist. He actually was a revolutionary democratic internationalist in the context of his times. And it was a very courageous kind of stance. People also think that Sheikh Mujib simply followed Suhrawardi. That's not true either. There are historical records, both in the form of letters and also in the form of his public stance, that he opposed Suhrawardi's stance in the 50s that Bangla should only be a regional language, not a state language. He opposed that in a very forthright manner. Also, he was respectful, as we are culturally, I suppose, but also through long association of Suhrawardi. But he revived Awami League after military repression from the coup of 1958 by Ayub Khan especially. As you know, there were 2 coups in 1958, one by Iskandar Mirza, and then the second one by Ayub Khan against Iskandar Mirza. And Ayub Khan banned all political activities for a number of years. So it was because of Bangabandhu that Awami League was revived. And I don't want to go into the long history. I've described the blow-by-blow details, and some of the key actors like Maulana Abdul Rashid Tarkobagish actually was a relative. And so I have some personal knowledge, quite unintentionally picked up, during my childhood and my adolescence from those days. But what was really significant, I think, during this phase of Bangabandhu's activities was both the principled support of autonomy for all provinces of Pakistan. At that time, there was this so-called one unit in West Pakistan. There were at least 4 provinces involved in that one unit. But also Bangabandhu knew that you have to build a left-center coalition in order to do that. There were others in the party who did not, of course, feel that way, including Maulana Abdul Rashid Tarkobagish, I'm sad to say. But tactically, Bangabandhu was very careful to not alienate Maulana, because Maulana was the only elder leaders, or the only one among the elders who supported the revival of Awami League. So to that extent, I think Maulana Abdul Rashid Tarkobagish made a great contribution, as he did earlier, being the first one to actually walk out of the Provincial Assembly meeting when the police opened fire on students on the 21st of February 1952, killing at least 4 people among students and public on that day. Now, Bangabandhu tactically could be flexible without compromising his principles or his strategic vision. That is the point I want to make here. And Ayub regime correctly identified him as the main enemy of Pakistan, and therefore not only arrested him from time to time, and Munem Khan, who was the infamous governor of East Pakistan, appointed by Ayub Khan, certainly was the person who carried out these repressive policies almost with a personal vengeance. In my book, I have described the incident where the students, very courageous students of Dhaka University, refused to take their degrees from Munem Khan, and that led to a great pandemonium. At one point, Munem Khan was seen to wear a police helmet and direct the police in various parts of the pandal where that event was taking place, so that the police could more effectively beat up the students. Such was a person who went along with Ayub and helped Ayub repress the people of East Pakistan, but especially Bangabandhu and his close colleagues, as well as the leftist leaders in the then East Pakistan. But it was in 1966 that Bangabandhu and Awami League came out with the 6 points. There is a long history of 6 points, also its connection with the earlier 21 points of 1954 United Front platform and manifesto. I have discussed all those in my book. But to push the narrative a little forward and finish this part quickly, let me just say that Sheikh Mujib and his colleagues indeed faced death many times, and this Agartala conspiracy trial, so to speak, the so-called trial, was definitely, if successful, going to lead to death sentences for Sheikh Mujib and many others. And it was only stopped by a mass upheaval. This is where I think that what I have called the polychronotope, that is a multifaceted, multi-directional mass movement emerges with many voices from the 6th of December meeting at Paltan Maidan in 1968 onwards, gaining crescendo in 1969, the early months of 1969. And looking back, I feel truly fortunate that I was young, that I was what some people might call idealistic. I certainly didn't understand real politics very much, but I felt very deeply, very strongly I had my young body to throw into the fray, and I did, like many others. Many of the demonstrations, meetings, I went to and became part of. I have described them in my latest book, especially because this book is more about mass movements than the others. I remember the meetings in January, the coming out of the students with the 11 points then. So you can see why I have 11 points, because 11 points actually were more complete than the 6 points. It certainly included 6 points, but it also had demands, not as clearly or rigorously as one might have wished, but definitely clearly enough the demands from the workers, from the peasants, from lower middle class students and lower middle class people. So it was economically and politically a more complete manifesto of the people. And Bangabandhu accepted that immediately when it was taken to him. He was in jail at that time in cantonment. You can read about that from the book by Wajed Ali Mia, his son-in-law, whom also I was very fortunate to know as a student of science. I studied science, and as you know, he was a scientist. I have described that in my first book. The upshot was that the mass movement actually gained clarity, and with all the 11 points, there was a further point that could be heard in various slogans, which was Jeler Tala Bhangbo, Sheikh Mujib ke Anbo, that we will actually rip apart the locks of the prison and we will get Sheikh Mujib out. This became an extremely popular slogan, and in a way it crystallized, it condensed the sentiment of the people, and also the need of the hour, the need of the mass movement of the hour. And I've discussed those details, the political details. But I want to remember the strength of the students. When political leaders were floundering and Bangabandhu was in jail and many of his colleagues were also in jail, the students actually pushed the movement forward. And finally, in February, with much sacrifice, we have to remember all of them, but especially Asaduzzaman, who was martyred on the 20th of January, 1969, of Sergeant Zahrul Haq, who was martyred on 15th of February, 1969, of Dr. Shamsud Joha in Rajshahi University on February 17th, I think, and so many others. And many of these people I had met, I knew. Others in the audience can remember that they also knew. Many of them inspired me personally. So it is not without some emotion that I can remember those days and talk about them. But after the release of Bangabandhu, actually he became Bangabandhu on the 23rd of February, 1969 in a mass meeting, which probably was the biggest mass meeting. At that time it was called Race Course. Today it's Suwardi Uddan, and I think Shishu Park is in the location. That was a very moving moment. But there were many other meetings and many people who participated. So to wrap up this part, I just want to mention the economic strategy of Bangabandhu. This is clearly laid out actually in his pre-electoral speech of 1970, Most people think that he just wanted a hodgepodge of policies. Unfortunately, some of his advisors who knew him seem to think so, and some of them admitted to me that they have not read his 1970 speech and had forgotten about them if they listened to it at that time. Also, there was the manifesto of Awami League, the pre-election manifesto. In both of them, there is a very clear strategic goal of egalitarianism, of what people meant at that time roughly by socialism, which was basically nationalizing key industries to run them through the public sector, and most importantly, to make sure that people have fair wages and a decent standard of living, that students have opportunities to pursue their education regardless of the economic conditions of their families, and many others. And if you read the 1970 speech, which I have translated into English for those of my listeners here who don't know Bangla, you will see that he has very clear criticisms of the inequalities and economic injustices in Pakistan, and very clear guidelines about how to move towards the future. And let me wrap up quickly so that we have time for discussion by moving into the third part. So we know that Awami League won massively in the elections of 1970. The details are in my book and in many other books. And then we have the January meeting, January 3rd meeting, which was really an oath-taking by all the elected members not to betray the people. And it was particularly moving for all of us who were present at that time there. And then, of course, we know about the betrayals by Bhutto, the Pakistani leader, and of course, the military junta led by Yahya Khan, and the bloody events that started on the night of the 25th of March, and the Liberation War. And Bangabandhu was in jail in West Pakistan during that time. He was tried, he was convicted by these people in this real mockery of a trial. And I think some people had the presence of mind there to know that you could not kill such a leader, that it won't be good for Pakistan itself. And Bhutto was among them. And when he was released finally, and he was sent to first England, and then from England he came through India to Bangladesh. It was a massive reception and welcome that he was given, but he also knew that the country was devastated, that it will take time to rebuild. If you read his speech in the parliament in October 1972, I think that was shortly after the constitution was made. The constitution is not perfect. I will be the first one to say that, but it is much better than any of the constitutions that Pakistan ever had or pretended to have. And it was done in record time, I must say, in the history of constitution making in the world. And we have to also thank the people who were involved in drafting this constitution. But in that speech in 1972, Bangabandhu talks about the tremendous sacrifices, the problems that a country like Bangladesh faces in economic development sector especially, and the need for cooperation with all the countries in the world. He really showed a great deal of skill in foreign policy making by identifying the friends and foes correctly, but also realizing that a poor country, especially like Bangladesh, basically has to be very pragmatic in its foreign policy making, and therefore we cannot really have permanent enemies. And he was therefore not only eager to deepen relationships with friends, friendly countries, but also to establish relationships with countries which were not so friendly at the moment, countries such as the United States and China. And he was making headways in many ways. He also tried to maintain good relationships with the Islamic countries. Saudi Arabia, to the very end, was opposed to him and to Bangladesh. They changed their mind only after the bloody coup of 15th of August. And then China was actually coming along. There's much more solid proof that China was will have established relationships with Bangladesh, because on the economic front, already many advances were made. So that I think we can say with some degree of certainty. And even Pakistan recognized Bangladesh in February 1974, and in September 1974, Bangabandhu was in New York. He gave a speech in Bangla, which I was fortunate to actually listen to from the visitors gallery in the General Assembly on the 25th of September, 1974. And in that speech, which I have translated also, and it's in my book, so people who know only English can read that. He, I think, established himself as a leader of the same international stature as the previous leaders of the non-aligned movement. And at that time, actually, the Algerian leader, who was another leader of the non-aligned movement, was in the chair. And it really was a high point in retrospect of the non-aligned movement, for which I think there is a great need today as well, as we see a second kind of Cold War unfolding. For the poor countries, for countries that need to focus on their internal problems of building democracy and egalitarian society. They really gain nothing from participating in Cold War type of politics by following one big power or another. So I think Bangabandhu correctly identified the strategy of small, poor countries like Bangladesh from what was then called the Third World. So in conclusion, I will simply say that Bangabandhu really was not only just a leader for a small country like Bangladesh, he was also a leader of the world, of all people, but especially for non-aligned people of the world. So instead of saying too many things right now, I will conclude by reading you a few lines from a poem that I wrote in Bengali. Then, as my friend Pilal used to say, there are no translations of poetry, only transcreations. So I have a transcreation in English. I will read you the full English poem, and but I will begin with the Bengali poem. It's really about Bangabandhu's life and death. So the Bengali poem goes like this. সময়কে উদ্ধার করি চলো। সেদিনও তো এমনই ছিল, সেদিনও তো ফুটেছিল ফুল, তারারা আলো জ্বেলেছিল। আজ চেয়ে আছি আমরা সকলে তোমার চশমার চূর্ণ টুকরোর দিকে, তোমার নিভে যাওয়া পাইপের পানে। দুর্দিনের ইতিহাস শেষ হবে এই জেনে, প্রার্থনায় নত জানু আমরা সবাই। ফিরে এসো হে বান্ধব, ফিরে এসো সাহসের আগুন জ্বালাতে, ফিরে এসো সাগ্নিক যমদগ্নি বাংলার অগ্নিপুরুষ, সাহসী মানুষদের নিয়ে আবার শুধু আর একটি বার সেই সাহসী সময়টাকে উদ্ধার করি চলো। In English, let us redeem our time. I want to redeem le temps perdu, the lost time. Saw your picture still hanging in the same place, lost to my consciousness in the swirl of everyday life. Today, I want to redeem le temps perdu, the lost time. Your face looks more alive than before, your eyes opening an immensity before me takes us far, far away. The rusted mirror of my mind shows the picture of another spring, long time ago. A sudden shaft of light floods my memory. That day was like today, with flowers blooming. Stars sent their faint light. Perhaps the cuckoo was singing then too, hoping that the sorrows of beloved Bangla, the nightmare of history, will finally be over. Today, I'm looking at the broken pieces of your eyeglasses. Today, I'm looking at your extinguished pipe, knowing the nightmare of history will end. We all bow in prayer. Come back, our friend. Come back to light the fire of courage. Come back like the fiery sage Jamadagni. Come back, the intrepid son of Bengal. Come back just to gather all with courage, just once more. Come, let us redeem that time without fear. Teach us once more, just once more, to walk and work together, facing the force of future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your wonderful thoughts and ideas to the audience. So many questions and comments came up, and there were so many interesting facts through your lectures. So I'm sure the audience might have some queries on that. So now let me begin with the question answer session. The very first question is your impression on the post-war economic strategies of Bangladesh.
Okay, shall I answer this now or shall I wait for a few questions? Okay.
Yeah, it's up to you if you would like
Okay,
to
well, I'm an
take them up
economist,
one by one.
Economic strategy is a very natural question, I think, for the viewers to ask about and for me to answer. First of all, we have to remember that the economy of Bangladesh was war-torn, was devastated, and the immediate reconstruction was the most important necessity. And there wasn't much in terms of resource. United States, which could have helped, was actually at that time completely opposed to the very idea of Bangladesh and tried to stop it throughout the period of the Liberation War. India and Soviet Union, the two close allies, did not have much in the way of resources, and whatever came was not enough. And Bangabandhu knew that. The planning commission that he gathered together was certainly headed by a very able, perhaps the most able economist of that time, Professor Nurul Islam, with whom I have had many conversations about that period and others, and I still continue our conversation. According to him and others, the 5-year plan that was prepared was in many ways incomplete because we didn't even have many of the basic data that are necessary for adequate planning. Apart from not having enough physical capital, not having adequate infrastructure, Bangladesh also had very little in the way of trained and skilled human resources. So inevitably, many mistakes were made. There were administrative failures. There was corruption. It was not unnoticed by Bangabandhu. If you look at the political economy, there was also the political challenge both from the ultra-right and the ultra-left during that period that made it very difficult to govern the country. So there were multiple problems, but those who say that if we just had neoliberalism, if we opened up the markets and let the market solve all the problems, I think must be living in a different universe. We have had now almost 60 years of neoliberalism, both in the West and in developing countries. And for the most part, neoliberalism has been a failure. As I discuss in my own writing, that's also 11-point writing for strategy of development as freedom, as I call it, following my great teacher, Professor Amartya Sen. You need strategic openness, which is what China really practiced. So Chinese development experience is not a vindication of neoliberalism or open and free markets. And same is true of Japan, of East Asian development. All the cases that I have studied very carefully, deeply, extensively, and have published a great deal, including some books on these. So Bangladesh was really between a rock and a hard place at that time. And some things could have been done better with more experience. Some of our economists were perhaps too idealistic, but mostly we were constrained by physical resources and human resources. We are much better off today, so we should be able to make much better policies, and I have been urging our government to do that. I have contributed concretely both in the areas of agriculture and in the area of information and communications technologies. But I think we need to go back to that time and understand that time in the context, in the historical context and resource constraints of that time.
Thank you. So we have another question. In your opinion, what were the reasons behind the rapid failure of the Ayub Khan's basic democracy movement?
Okay, that brings a smile to my face because I remember this episode from Basic Democracy in our neighborhood, which was in Azimpur area of Dhaka. During Basic Democracy, the opposition, it was called Combined Opposition Party, COP, their candidate was a local candidate, and his symbol was Balti, which was a pail, right? The English, rough English translation. And at that time, that was my first experience in campaigning as a singer, along with my friend, who is very famous. You probably have heard of him, and he's singing Niaz Muhammad Chaudhuri, Liaquat Bhai. They would make these huge pails. We'd sit inside the pail, and with harmonium, we would sing and exhort the public to vote in that box marked by the Balti. Anyway, more seriously, the advice for basic democracy actually came from none other than the American advisors of Ayub Khan. Ayub Khan was very dependent on American advisors, both on the economic front and on the political front, and certainly on the military front. That started long before Ayub. So they thought that it would be a great idea to have electoral college. So 40,000 from West Pakistan, 40,000 from East Pakistan, ignoring the basic inequities even among in these numbers. The whole idea was so that they could, the elites could control politics, and people really would not have much of a say. And the model really came from what today we know to be the failed American model of 1787, which was a compromise between the northern anti-slavery states and the southern pro-slavery states. So electoral college is no democracy really, and Americans now bitterly know that truth. In Bangladesh, actually, we were pioneering in a sense by opposing this basic democracy and actually destroying this basic democracy in a more openly democratic manner of mass revolt.
Okay, so we have another question, and that is, to what extent you think the notion of public reasoning restricts the right to freedom of expression?
That is a very deep question. Reasoning is a fine thing. I agree with that proposition. It has a long time honored tradition, but also people can express themselves in other ways. They can express themselves through physical gestures. They can express themselves through poetry. They can express themselves through songs, music, dancing. All those things are very important. They are not completely disconnected from reason, but I think we should not put reason on a pedestal and worship it, because French Revolution, which did that, which put reason on a pedestal, also became very cruel, and in the name of reason, many crimes were committed. As somebody wrote once, liberty, oh liberty, what crimes are committed in thy name? So we have to be careful. It's a very good question, very deep question. And in philosophical schools of post-structuralism and some schools of postmodern philosophy, postmodern psychoanalysis, we have explored what I would not call them irrational, but non-rational parts of our mind, the unconscious parts of our mind. And we should remember also the role of heart in everything. And Blaise Pascal, who was a very deep thinker, philosopher, scientist, mathematician, said very aptly, I think, that the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know. The heart has its reasons, which reason does not know. Thank you.
So we have another question, and that is, do you think the local politics and movement are gradually lacking its importance because of the global movements?
I think there has to be a relationship between the local and the global. An American politician, Tip O'Neill, once said, all politics is local. He was mentioning politics as usual, not revolutionary politics. But even revolutionary politics is local. Anyone who has studied histories of any of the revolutions deeply by good historians from the English Revolution to the French Revolution to the Russian Revolution to Paris Commune, which happened earlier than Russian Revolution, to Chinese Revolution. There are many books now actually on these about local histories, both of revolution and of counter-revolution. Those are worthwhile to read. I think because of mass media, because of internet, communication is very rapid, and also there is a kind of, it's not my expression, one of my former students who worked for the UN said that it was kind of activist tourism. And it's true to some extent, unfortunately, that people who think that they are the leaders of these movements travel or used to travel before COVID-19 crisis. And now we do a lot of things through Zoom, which is fine. But one should not be deceived by the symbolism and the ubiquity of this kind of images, this kind of presences, this kind of meetings by a few leaders, or by just media that only literate people in the world can follow. All struggles have their roots in local injustices, local violations of people's rights, and local resistances. The greatness of revolutionary leaders like Bangabandhu is to realize that a political party has to do two things. One, it has to organize those inchoate, fragmented, localized ideas into a bigger idea. But the origins are from those local struggles. And secondly, the party must organize the people as a people and therefore connect those local struggles. So today we need political parties more than ever, but perhaps a coalition of parties in different parts of the world who have to organize this struggle. As you can tell, I'm not an anarchist, although in my heart I support all kinds of struggles and rebellions. I think politics requires much more than just spontaneous rebellions and the collection of media images that we see frequently. They are there and they are necessary even, but they cannot build a movement. They cannot lead a movement towards final victory.
So with keeping in mind the memories and massive upsurge of Gana Adalat, or the People's Tribunal in the 1990s in Bangladesh, the question is how the voices of women can be raised more in the mass movements in present.
This is a very good question. In my books, I have discussed, of course, the role of the women leaders at that time, but they came mostly from among the educated middle classes. People like Begum Sufia Gamal, for example, my own sisters, and mothers and sisters of other people who are in the audience. Today, some have started writing a kind of subaltern history of our liberation movement. It needs to be done for pre-liberation period. And I've seen several books written by both men and women based on interviews. Again, local histories of the liberation movement and the roles of women. But I can tell you from my own personal experience that especially in East Pakistan Student Union and the student union that I was part of was led by a woman, Begum Mutia Chaudhary, or Mutiapa, who was called Ogni Kunna, or the daughter of fire, the fiery daughter. And there were many like Mutia Chaudhary in local areas. The first I was almost going to say pilgrimage. First time I went barefoot to grave of Abul Barkat, one of the martyrs of the language movement from our neighborhood. It was organized by Helen Appa, who was a woman. And so there were many, many women in many, many localities who organized resistance and movements. And I think that history needs to be told. That history needs to be grasped better. I'm all for middle-class feminism, which is what is dominating today. But there is also such a thing as working-class feminism, of peasant feminism, and women have written about them. They have done much for the cause. We can very easily prepare a list of books and and articles, and it should be done, really, I think, because I support feminism of all kind, but I'm also aware that bourgeois feminism has its limits, because these feminists will never want to overturn the unjust economic system which oppresses people, including women, from the lower classes, the working classes, the peasantry, the lower middle class. This is a grave limitation of bourgeois feminism.
We have another question in hand, and it's about your perspective on Archer Bartlett's role during the Bangladesh genocide in 1971.
Well, I have very good memories of the late Archer Blood. Actually, Archer Blood was the one who gave me the visa to come to the United States, because I was invited by World Youth Forum, which was partly supported by the State Department at that time. It was one of the more progressive liberal organizations in the US. So I remember visiting him in his house, because it was a Sunday. I had my first conversation with him at that time. And it was clear to me that he was sympathetic to Bengalis. Of course, he did not discuss politics with me. Then after he was punished for his brave acts in support of the cause of liberation in Bangladesh, or I should say just cause of humanitarianism in Bangladesh, because he was an American diplomat who supported the Cold War policies of the United States. I don't want to make him into a saint, but he was a profoundly humane person. He was a very sober person. I met him several times in the US. I have read his book, of course, and I've cited from his book in my books. He was first and foremost a very humane person, and a person who wanted peace. But I don't think he ever quite analyzed very deeply the roots of Cold War. That wasn't part of his job description anyway. And he taught in Allegheny College towards the end of his life. And he told me once that that was the part that he enjoyed the most. Earlier, he was an ambitious diplomat, but after his ambitions were frustrated because of his very brave and moral actions, he thought much more deeply about what he really wanted to do with his life. And I think it is just and fitting that Bangladesh has honored him. And I hope that as long as Bangladesh exists, people will remember him and thank him, and other people who were also at the consulate at that time with Archer Blood.
Very interesting question, and perhaps the last question in this lecture is, how would you evaluate the movements and actions against history distortion?
Well, as a historian, I have to be against those things, but I think more important is to understand why distortions occur. If you're a trained historian who is disciplined, hardworking, and has a historian's conscience, I think detecting the distortions will not be very hard. But I think we need to understand why distortions are necessary what interests, what concrete interests, and what conjunctures of ideas, what conjunctures of political, economic, and social developments in history lead to these distortions. History is not linear. As I said, we live in complex economic, political, and social systems, and complexity means that it is not linear, it is non-linear. History is non-linear. History goes forward, but history also goes backward, and history writing also goes forward sometimes and goes backward at other times. Fortunately, along with bad historians, we also have good historians. Along with historians without conscience, the opportunistic historians, we also have historians with conscience, historians who are not opportunistic, who have a historian's conscience.
Thank you, sir. We are almost at the end of this event. So with this, I would like to conclude this event. Once again, I thank the audience for being a part of this occasion from different time zones, and also thank our speaker in the event for his insightful deliberation. In our team today, we had Shariful Islam Shaun, Hasibul Haq Imon, and Hassan Mahmoud Oyon on behalf of the museum, who assisted us with a smooth technical support to run this uninterrupted event. We shall have another webinar for you on the 14th August on the role of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in initiating trial process, ensuring justice to the victims of Bangladesh genocide. We hope to have you in the event as well. Keep connected with us in the official Facebook page of the Center for the Study of Genocide and Justice. Thank you so much and good night.
Thank you, everyone.